No, before anyone says it, the irony of my being a philosophy channel while saying philosophy is pointless isn't lost on me. But being an exercise in futility doesn't mean we can't also seek pleasure in our solely human gifts. After all, given that we're all slated to die and even the universe will eventually splutter and fade to black, isn't everything we do leading to the same inexorable end? It's like I say at the end of nearly every video, life's too short to be taken seriously. But in any event, I didn't bring you here just to give you flashbacks to your moody teenage edgelord phase. I've had more than a few people over this last year leave comments writing off what I was saying as cynical and/or nihilistic. This last one got me to think one of the two possible definitions of cynical, according to Google, is believing that people are motivated purely by self-interest. The other being concerned only with one's own interests and typically disregarding accepted or appropriate standards in order to achieve them. And while I'll not argue that my outlook doesn't fit the first definition like a glove, that doesn't make it incorrect. But before I address the second idea, let's quickly dissect the other accusatory term, nihilism. Again, according to Google Dictionary, nihilism is the rejection of all religious and moral principles in the belief that life is meaningless, similar to how most people only hear the first part of Machiavelli's most infamous aphorism that it's better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. Even among those people who actually have some idea how to properly use English words, most only tend to know nihilism by the second part of that definition. Now, I could sit here all day elucidating how my perspectives on life, the universe, and everything are actually much deeper, more sophisticated, and nuanced than could be summarized in a 10-word limp nod, which is a term I've just coined for those words or phrases like Nazi, or demonic, or deviant, or you're a weirdo bro. People tend to toss out like flashbangs at things that offend or confuse them when they lack a more articulate comeback. But I'm not going to do that because, as a more enlightened commenter once observed, it doesn't matter what you say, you never actually convince anyone of anything. All you're really doing is resonating with people who are predisposed to already align with your ideas. I look at it like this. Imagine a row of animals all locked in a cage. If you drop a hunk of meat into the cage, even if they're literally starving to death, the herbivores won't even think to look at it because it simply won't register to them as food. And yes, I realize this isn't the best analogy I could have come up with, since true obligate herbivores and carnivores are actually a lot rarer than high school biology class led us all to believe. But I think you all get my point regardless. One of the first adult lessons I ever learned was that the Enlightenment era idea of humans being primarily rational, as opposed to the quote-unquote lesser orders of animals' primarily instinctive and emotional natures, was a great steaming pile of hogwash. And before I had a fully realized grasp on the concept of natural selection, I wondered why it was that evolution hadn't removed emotionality from our systems, given how often maladaptive they've proved to be. The answer my then adolescent brain came up with was that emotions served as the default man-to-man intercom frequency, without which our second greatest power as a species would have been almost unusably nerfed. However, the more technical answer is that emotions are the weights and measures by which we make our judgments. For example, if a close platonic friend invites me over to their house, that has a completely different affectional gravity than if somebody you hardly know from Adam, or if someone you had sexual or romantic interest in asked you the same thing. Essentially, emotions exist to tell us how, where, and when we should move, which they do in supplement to our baser instincts of pleasure-seeking and pain avoidance by further classifying all our sensory input into one of 5 boxes, each of which carrying a certain instinctive action tag, i.e., do X when you see Y. And above this, our reason exists to break down novel experiences into these pre-existing molds. People, when you get right down to it, are literally just walking, talking, self-important bags of chemicals. Extremely complicated chemicals, granted, but chemicals nonetheless. Chemistry is governed by the laws of material reality, also known as physics. And as physics are determinable, so too are our natures and actions determinable. In essence, if I have perfect knowledge of the exact state of anything that exists at any given moment in time, I'd be able to calculate with 100% certainty its exact state at any other moment in time, past, present, or future. Now, as far as first principles go, we can get about as far as I think, therefore I am, before we have to start making assumptions. And in order for any logical or rational argument to carry any water whatsoever, there's three assumptive pillars we have to set down. 1. The universe exists, meaning there exists some form of reality independent from our own minds. 2. We can learn things about it, meaning the independent reality behaves according to predictable laws, which creates observable patterns. And 3. Models with predictive capabilities are more useful than ones without. The reason we have to make all these assumptions is because, were any one of them to ever be proven false, any and all attempts at understanding anything would be rendered moot. The older I get, the more I see and hear and read, the more I'm convinced of the folly of attempting to win over hearts and minds. I once likened the practice of debating an ideologue to trying to talk a hermit off an island he's lived on his whole life that I know is about to be washed away by a typhoon. From his perspective, everything he knows and has is on that little patch of doomed rock and soil. On top of that, his land is steady and firm, and he can see my boat rocking and rolling on the waves. And obviously, he's also never encountered a storm of such a magnitude as I've just described, or else he wouldn't still be around to hear my warning. So what I'm actually asking is for him to not merely abandon everything he has and has ever known, but also to trust the words of someone he's just met over his lifelong experience and the evidence of his own eyes and ears. Throw onto that a mountain of carefully cultivated peer pressures and status pyramids, and you begin to understand why a woke zealot or Scientologist or a religious fundamentalist of any description would far more easily assume I'm the brainwashed lunatic than seriously consider anything I have to say. If you're still struggling to cope with the concept of a wholly alien worldview, try this. Imagine if any conspiracy theory you've ever heard were actually true. Now, imagine you've been ensconced in a world from birth that's told you that to even consider such notions is ridiculous and stupid. I know it's a bit of a stretch, but if we don't work the old imagination muscles every now and again, they'll wither into dust, and then where would we be? And yes, that is a rhetorical question. The answer is the salt mines. We'd all be in the salt mines, or in the pods eating the bugs, or in the ground with the bugs. Whatever, you get the point. Now, the psychiatric definition of a delusion is a demonstrably false belief that persists even in light of contrary evidence. I've often taken umbrage with the idea that there exist certain problems which cannot be solved by reason alone. This is true, but only because these problems have no solutions which are emotionally or politically acceptable. For example, see either the existent class or gender wars. These conflicts cannot be resolved by reason because the form of resolution being sought is a return to the post-war status quo, which was a freak, happenstantial fluke, a blip on the historical radar, not a natural precedent to be reset. According to the people invested in that status quo, however, the fundamental failure lies not with their preferred options or systems, but with reality itself. The same could be said for the woke left, as of the religious right. Both seek utopias that defy the natural order, that necessitate a wholesale retooling of the natural order, i.e. the reinvention of humanity, and subsequently of the human world, into an image more to their personal liking, which is either impossible according to objective reality, or else would require more thought and effort to bring about than they're willing to put forth. And so they resort to covert emotional manipulation, to propaganda, and to thought policing to force the rest of humanity to act out their utopian agendas, which always results in tyranny, oppression, dystopia, and abject suffering and misery for all but the select elite, which naturally always specifically includes the prophets and their close affiliates. And this is why I say philosophy is ultimately pointless. Most people, no matter how they may plead, don't actually want truth. They want instruction and/or permission to do what's in their own best interests. People who resonate with certain ideas over others do so not for their logical or empirical merits, but for their utility to the listener's individual goals or agendas. If you don't believe me, or even if you do, ask yourself why. Chances are it's because I've touched on some personal point of superiority or inferiority of yours, and your instinct was to either attack that which has offended you or to indulge your appetite for vindication as you would indulge your sweet tooth. I've said it before, and I'll say it a million times more. Morality is the first and favorite bastion of people who are either too stupid or stubborn to admit they've lost the argument, or who know they never really had a fighting chance to begin with. As soon as any conversation switches from facts and evidence to morals and ethics, we know without needing to be told who the facts and logic ultimately support and who they don't. The same as how you know which army is stronger before the battle even starts by who's looking for the nearest spot of high ground to retreat to. Like any other form of tool, words and ideas are valuable insofar as they're useful. One of the most invaluable pieces of advice I was given regarding women is that words are like magic spells to them. It doesn't matter what the words mean, but the effect they have. That's why women and effeminate men throw out words like Nazi, incel, satanic, evolutionist, etc. at those whose metaphysical battleground is beyond their powers of logic or reason to contest. This is why I brought up the accusations of cynicism and nihilism from before. Not because I'm personally bothered by these things, I've been called far worse, but simply because it perfectly encapsulates the phenomenon I'm choosing to coin the faulty reduction chain. One of the most common responses from religious types upon meeting an atheist is to ask some version of the question, "Why do you hate God?" To which the obvious answer is, "I don't. I just don't believe," meaning I'm not convinced, "there's a magical anthropomorphic immortal overseeing the whole of reality." The reason this is their default reaction, whereas the rationalist's response to someone whose way of thinking is foreign to him is to inquire further with the intent of discerning its origins and workings, is due to the personal investment most religious proponents put into their preferred moral quarters. In other words, the more of your own identity and lifestyle you've invested into a particular belief system or narrative structure, the more resistance you're going to put up against anyone or anything threatening to undercut its authority and thus to dilute its power, whether intentional or not. If you've heard the name Sigmund Freud, you're almost certainly aware of the tri-brain theory, even if you're unfamiliar with the term. You might be acquainted with the ego, the superego, and the id. Or perhaps you may know them better by their more modern terms, the hindbrain, aka the lizard brain or brainstem, which is the autonomic and reflex motor portion, the midbrain, aka the monkey brain, which handles the emotions, and the neocortex, aka the forebrain, the big wrinkly part on top that does all the fancy hi-fi stuff like abstract philosophizing and logical examination. Given that evolution always builds from the bottom up and can only ever iterate on existing patterns, not truly innovate, i.e., it cannot undo, restart, or invent new patterns from scratch, it thus stands to reason that the higher regions must serve functions the lower orders cannot, and their workings must be fundamentally similar to their primitive progenitors. From this, I've constructed my own quaternary brain theory. These correspond to the 4 dimensions of the soul present in most modern and pre-modern myth and magic systems: the spirit, the mind, the heart, and the body. The idea is that sensory inputs, sights, sounds, smells, etc., get first taken in by the limbic system, the emotional processors, and then subsequently translated either up or down the ladder as much as needed to reach a particular goal or end state. However, this is its own entire sea of serpents that would be a disservice to everything and everyone involved to try and fully unpack here and now, so I'll just stash that in the future video folder for the time being. For right now, let my point be that what people want will ultimately dictate what information they prioritize. If you just hand them information and don't then tell them what to make of it, by which I mean you don't give them a way to assign a logical label and/or emotional weight to it, they'll either ignore it or they'll default to frustration or anger, since this is seen as preferable to a more vulnerable state like confusion or fear. But anyway, before I drag us down another fathomless wormhole, let me know your thoughts on all of this. I know I've said that there are 4 types of people in every culture: the lions, the dogs, the sheep, and the lambs, and that only the very last of these is ever worth the time and energy to debate, since they're the only one of the 4 who really places any value at all on honesty, integrity, or truth in the Platonic sense. And I still steadfastly hold that to be true, and increasingly more so by the day. But since I won't claim to be the absolute arbiter of fact and reality, or reason either for that matter, I'd like to hear what others have to say, if for no other reason than because the engagement lets the algorithm know you're a real person and not a nameless, faceless chatbot. So be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you want to do me a solid. Also, check out my books and merch and other stuff at the links down below if you've a coin to spare on my expense. And with all that said and done, as usual, until next time, my friends, stay safe, stay sane, and remember, if your name's not on their will, their birth certificate, or their payroll, you don't owe anyone else a goddamn thing. Peace be upon you.